So intrepid is a word I would use to describe Michael Skelly on a bicycle. When I first met Michael, he invited me to his house for breakfast, and I actually rode my bike over to meet him. And as we were having breakfast, as we were leaving, he said, "Can you give me a ride downtown?" But I was on my bicycle, and it was just sort of amusing that the two of us ride around everywhere, and neither one of us had a car, but we figured it out later that day. So with great pleasure, I bring you Michael Skelly.
First of all, thanks for including me. My day job is transmission line development for renewable energy, and believe it or not, this stuff can be a lot more exciting than building power lines around the country. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the experience on Bayou Greenways, and because I think it's instructive to where we are as a city and some of the directions that we're headed in. And there was this idea of Comey's plan sort of got resurrected in the early 2000s, and it was a lot of conversations among the Greater Houston Partnership and other folks like that. And those of us at the Parks Board around 2010 began to realize that if this thing was ever going to happen, somebody had to pick up the ball and run with it. So we decided and the Parks Board had been doing some amount of trail work around town, but we said, all right, at this pace, it's going to take us another 50 years to finish. And under Tom Bacon's inspired leadership, we said, we got to get after it. So we went to Mayor Parker in 2011, and you all may recall that we were sort of coming out of a recession then, and said, we want to put on the ballot $100 million to fund this ambitious plan, and we think we can come up with another $100 million. And it wasn't mentioned, but prior to getting into politics, the mayor worked in accounting, and her accounting, she's good with numbers, and she said, that's great, let me see the numbers. And so we did a poll, and it looked like, despite some, sort of unsteady economic times, we might be able to rally the votes. So we went out and carried the day with a big win. 68% of the voters in Houston voted to effectively spend their tax dollars to build out Bayou Greenways. And during this polling and during this campaign process, we learned a lot of interesting stuff. Among them, you'll be pleased to know, Mayor Taylor, that when we polled people, we go out and the greatest support that we got was actually from African American women. And those were the folks who said, yeah, I believe in this, I want a safe place for my kids, this is important to my neighborhoods. And the other thing that we found was that as you did sort of neighborhood meetings was we'd go out with this grand vision and the Comey plan and the partnership, and we're going to attract millennials and all this other good stuff. And everybody said, well, that's great, like what are you doing in my neighborhood? How is this going to look? And that speaks to the power of what's going to happen with Bayou Greenways, because as we build out these greenways, people will be talking about what's going on in their neighborhood, because as you've seen on the maps, the wonderful thing about the bayous is they go through every single neighborhood. And we believe, and we're already feeling it, that as we build out these greenway trails, we're going to change, and we're beginning to change the conversation around Houston. So 10 years ago, as Bill just suggested, the conversation, if you talked about things like bike plans and sidewalks and complete streets and non-automotive ways to get around, people kind of looked at you like you were a little bit daft. But what we're finding as Buffalo Bayou has gotten built out, people are saying, hey, I want a safe way to get to that park. As we build out the trails on Sims and White Oak and Braes Bayous, everybody says, okay, I don't want to drive there, I want to walk there. And that's changing the whole conversation citywide about what it means to have a city. And it perhaps is going to be the most powerful thing that's going on. And I'd also mention that changing the conversation it's fantastic in many ways, but in other ways it's making us ask a lot of hard questions. And as you all have seen on the maps, many of the signature parks that are getting built around town are in high-income areas. And so now the question is coming up, wait a minute, if all the parks are sort of not so great, then nobody sort of wonders, what's the problem here? But when you start building great parks in relatively high-income neighborhoods, people ask the very legitimate question, hey, what about my neighborhood? There's a lot of people here, they're low income, and if anything, they have a greater need for a park than anybody else. But that change in the conversation, I think it's something that everybody in this room embraces, but it does raise big questions about how we're going to get this done. And it was mentioned earlier that 38% of the land in Houston is owned by one public entity or the other in terms of right-of-ways or other public facilities. And so as the conversation evolves, it's going to get a little bit more difficult. And that's where I think it's going to be especially important that we get very deep into the conversations that the two mayors that we've heard from have suggested, which is how do we make sure that elections do matter, and how do we make sure that we put in place or back political leaders who make the big decisions around how we're going to dedicate the city's resources, and do we pour them all into a single way of getting around town, or do we think about other ways to get around town? And then I thought I'd sort of close with a thought the way I sort of think about Houston, I've been here about 15 years, and sometimes I have a really good Houston day. And a good Houston day is weather like today, and you're out and about, or you're riding your bicycle, or you're checking out the greenways, and you're going, wow, this is like the most amazing place on earth. And then a bad Houston day would remind me of, and maybe this was referred to there was a reference in some of the earlier discussions about the Houstonization. And I don't know if they were talking about, you guys will recall John Kenneth Galbraith's admonition in The Affluent Society, and what he basically said was that in a highly consumeristic society, you end up with a dynamic where the private consumption of goods is sort of the ultimate manifestation of what one should do. And that can come at the expense of public good. So he said, if we're not careful, we will end up with private good and public squalor. And on a bad Houston day, I am reminded of what Galbraith said, because if we don't sort of stick to the task at hand, that's what we can sometimes revert to. But I think we're on the right track here. We're getting a lot of great stuff done. There's a tremendous amount of work ahead. We have indeed changed the conversation, but we're going to have to continue to stay at it in order to continue to think not only about parks and green space, but as Bill suggested, what is the shape of the city? What does the city look like? And what is really the quotidian experiences of how we live our daily lives, in addition to the wonderful signature parks, but how do we build into everybody's day some part of walking or getting around or using a sidewalk or bumping into their neighbors? How do we do that in a city that is so heavily automotive centric? I think we can do it, and these conversations are a big part of it, so thank you very much for the opportunity.